This is the historical assessment. Every person is susceptible to pain, emotional distress, and death associated with disease and trauma, and every person is motivated to lessen those effects. To understand the natural state of medical practice and to explain the profound conclusions concerning human progress that emerged from its study, we therefore use medical practice as a universal gauge of progress. Thus, first, we must analyze the great variety of medical practices that have existed throughout history and prehistory, so that characteristics of success or failure of human progress can be identified. To begin, there must be mention of the medicine man or shaman, who some think represents the ancient or primitive forebear of the modern physician. This is incorrect. The method of the medicine man has been, without exception, devoted to manipulating demons and controlling fellow humans, not disease. The medicine man, often the possessor of deviant behavioral characteristics, is shown to be the forebear of the psychic and the huckster, and he has no place in the history of medicine. Empirical medicine finds its roots instead in the anxious observations of practical individuals in family units or tribes who sought, without official sanction, remedies for pain and disease for themselves, their families, and neighbors. Then, with increasing regional populations, there developed larger societies and ultimately great civilizations. Chaos was prevented by authoritarian rule at the highest level and elitist interpretation of custom at lower levels. Mystical or theurgical beliefs accompanied the transformation of the medicine man to the diviner priest or seer, a more predictable form of population control. I propose, though, in the natural state of medical practice, that there was a brief period in the early formation of primary cities of several ancient civilizations that permitted individuals to provide specialized services, including medical practices, before centralization of power occurred. This brief period, which might span as much as 2 or 3 centuries, coincides with what scholars have termed a settlement hierarchy. By way of definition, a settlement hierarchy is the mechanism proposed as the natural way intergroup adjustments take place as an enlarging population center that has had no prior experience with a leadership hierarchy becomes more complex and must deal with new goods and services needed by the evolving society. I argue that it spontaneously appeared after people relinquished their tribal kinships in order to join a commercial enterprise during early urbanization, and it ceased with centralization of power. In my first example, the early Mesopotamian civilization of Sumer had acquired by 3100 BC an early form of rational medicine and a primordial physician, the Azu, although the nature of that medicine and its practitioners is only now being appreciated. The primary city-state of Uruk during the pre-dynastic or early dynastic period of Sumer is proposed as the source of its medical knowledge. Unequivocal documentation of the clinical acuity of Sumerian practitioners has been demonstrated in recent translations of the ancient Sumerian text, Treatise on Medical Diagnosis and Prognosis. But Akkadian conquerors then consolidated the individual Sumerian city-states and introduced the Asipu, or exorcist priest. Furthermore, this status persisted for the next 2,000 years of sequential monarchical empires that included Babylonian, Kassite, and Assyrian. Thus, mysticism prevailed early on, and as the Common Era approached, any Sumerian rational medicine had, despite some Babylonian emendations, long since ceased to exist. 900 miles to the west, ancient Egyptian medicine was evolving into what would be renowned as the foundation of Western medicine, although enthusiasm for this theory is far from unanimous. It is the writings of the pre-dynastic and earliest dynasties, also about 3100 BC, as revealed in the famous 1550 BC copies known as Papyrus Ebers and the Edwin Smith Papyrus, that provided insight into empirical and rational medical practices. But appropriated by the priest caste of the early pharaonic state, that empirical rational medicine regressed as it became manipulated canon. Thus, a mere 12 medical papyri grace the medicine of a 2,500-year-old empire, a component of many of the 12 being but repetitions of clinical cases or sections from Papyrus Ebers, which therefore must be considered the acme of Egyptian medicine 5,000 years ago. And so, despite a promising beginning, medicine in North Africa, just as in Mesopotamia, came to nothing long before the Common Era. Looking now to the east, there is a tenuous early historical record for Asian medicine, but the Huangti Neiqing Su Wen, or translated by Dr. Weiss as the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine, is a composite of clinical information assembled in the 2nd century BC and is said to encapsulate ancient Chinese medical thought. Legend and myth, however, propose the origin of its clinical material to be about 2500 BC, during the formative years of a unifying China under the Longshan culture emperor Huangdi. There are undoubtedly valid clinical diagnostics in this document, and especially important, it acknowledges the uniqueness of the individual patient. Nevertheless, in the form that has come down to us, its theories and treatments reveal a codified system of disease and pathophysiology with no basis in fact, a fabrication rather than a misunderstanding. It is remarkable that a civilization known for its many manifestations of brilliance would validate such a basis for medical practice. But the fault can be traced to a restrictive system of education and official examination by a central authority, and to a Confucian society willing to tolerate or unwilling or unable to challenge that authority. Instead, the rational ancient medical knowledge in the Huangti Neiqing Su Wen was altered and amended to become authoritative medical canon for elite practitioners. Exaggerating further their significance, emperors commissioned massive encyclopedic manuscripts of anecdotal herbal knowledge canvassed from their subjects, mostly useless information in which quantity was represented as quality. And this is the knowledge that persisted up to and was revived during the 20th century, when the People's Republic of China adopted it as a cheap alternative to Western medicine, and to the dismay of many, it has widely proliferated today as traditional Chinese medicine. In contrast, the perennial, itinerant, plebeian practitioners caring for the great mass of the Chinese population have always had a separate but unregulated and unrecorded existence. The earliest historical record of Indian medicine the Charaka Samhita, which has much of empirical worth, can, like Chinese medicine, be dated only to about 100 BC. Nevertheless, traditional Indian medicine, Ayurveda, is thought to have its origin in the Atharva Veda during the Vedic age, that someplace also as early as 2500 BC. But with the advent of Hinduism, about 500 BC, it came under the hegemony of the Brahmin or priest caste, even medical training being within their purview. Practitioners were viewed as low-class persons. The medical texts were infused with elements of Hinduism that changed their initially rational features to numinous. Concomitantly, there was centralization of medical authority within practitioner guilds that were integrated into regional monarchical governments. Despite the insertion of elements of Hippocratic medicine following Alexandrian and Islamic intrusions into the subcontinent, traditional Indian medicine would have changed little up to the present time, were it not for assimilation of elements of Western medicine since the 18th century. The popularity of Ayurveda in part rests on its being a less expensive alternative to scientific medicine. Now, moving halfway around the globe, the practice of medicine is barely definable in the ancient Americas. There's virtually no written medical literature. Some idea of the medical environment can be derived from figurines and herbal lore, but with no evidence of communication between professionals. The conclusion is that if there were practitioners, they were local medical empiricists. In many pre-Columbian societies, shamans were positioned to influence social direction, but no evidence of medical organization, professional or otherwise, has been identified in pre-Columbian art or other archaeological finds. Finally, in the contested lands between Mesopotamia and Egypt, there arose epical creeds and ideas. But historical assessment of their nomadic tribes is limited because of disruptions among their societies and the disappearance of perishable textual materials. The Bible is the principal source of their histories, in part supported by archaeological finds, in part at odds with them. Amid the flux of cultures and migratory tribes just to the east of the Mediterranean, it is ancient Hebrew medicine that is best documented, and that can be credited to religious writings that began to accumulate in the 8th century BC. Notable features of Hebrew medicine were an intolerance of magical devices and a distinction between medical practitioners and priests. Although the nature of medical practice is limited, it probably had rational as well as empirical components. But an unsettled tribal existence could explain why a formal and ultimately scientific medical organization did not develop. Roman domination provided the colophon to indigenous medical practices. Now, a profound inhibitory effect on medical progress has often been attributed to religions, and it is with this in mind that the Levant was chosen to conclude this brief view of primitive and ancient historical authoritarian societies and their effects on medical practice. For it was Hebrew prophets who first began to neutralize earthly authoritarianism using the morality of the individual as judged by an almighty God, thus opening a path to social equality. The profound consequences of this to medicine will be explained. In conclusion, a review of selected ancient civilizations reveals that several had evidence of a transient period in their earliest histories consistent with a rational medical practice. But within authoritarian society, medicine did not benefit from the social advantages of a metropolis or the efficiency of centralized services, inevitably and promptly becoming, with a limited exception of Hebrew medicine, manipulated canon. None of the regions cited can claim precedence in originating a natural state of medical practice or of progress toward scientific medicine, for none reached a steady state beyond that of the empirical. But the unheralded arrival of a new political system was soon to challenge and then surpass in greatness all that had gone before. And we come now to the ancient Greeks and Hippocrates. I have proposed three broad categories of reasoning available to the history of ideas. First is that which is reasoned by a solitary individual. A second, that which is being reasoned by unequals. And third, that which is being reasoned in common counsel. The first describes the individual, especially in primitive society, whose idea or discovery has little chance for propagation or improvement. There's simply no one else to critique or help implement that idea or discovery. The second introduces the ruler, chief, or patron that characterizes authoritarian relationships in societies large and small, whereby an idea or discovery essentially becomes the property of the more than equal, the chief, rather than the less than equal. That would be you and me. The third describes a consequence of the democratic trend that first developed in ancient Greece. That consequence is the koinon, a word you will hear frequently in this monologue, and which means common counsel, where members equally and openly shared, debated, and implemented their ideas. And I can't find an equivalent term in English. Now, Mycenaean Greece, the Greek Dark Ages, and the Archaic period, and that would cover roughly 1600 to 500 BC, provide little evidence for rational Greek medicine. But in the 5th century BC, matters had dramatically changed. At the same time, many Greek city-states had demonstrated broad acceptance of some degree of democratic governance. The principle of the koinon was applied not just to government alliances, but also to political, trade, and craft associations. Simultaneously, there emerged the availability of and a public preference for community practitioners of rational medicine, as corroborated by Thucydides' 425 BC description of the plague of Athens. That translation, by the way, along with translations of several important Hippocratic treatises, is to be found in Volume 2 of the Natural State of Medical Practice. And so I argue that over the preceding century, there was a gradual evolution of a collegial network of Hippocratic physicians, in effect, a medical koinon. Now, the earlier paragraphs of this summary of the ancient world have exposed authoritarian management of medicine as a guarantor of its survival, but not its progress. In Greece, the advance through monarchy, aristocracy, tyranny, and thence to democracy reflected political progress in Athens and other Hellenic city-states. And there was a corresponding decrease in centralization of power. You may wonder why a tyranny would immediately precede democracy, but as Euripides wrote, the tyrant must the many strive to please. And so some ancient Greek tyrannies have been likened to a primordial form of democracy, because the tyrants were requested by or depended upon the support of the people. In any event, concurrent with political progress, medical practice began to progress. In striking contrast, Sparta, which purposely chose to retain firm authoritarian governance, remained silent in medicine as in most other things, despite its proximity to Athens. It was at this time that the medical profession opened its ranks to those outside the traditional medical families. But it was the democratization of medical practice itself, the interaction of physician and patient, rather than the admission of outsiders, that led to one, the recognition of the uniqueness of each patient, two, the recognition of the complexity of diseases and their variability from patient to patient, and three, acknowledgement of the patient's role in contributing to and directing his own medical care. This democratization of Hellenic medicine, often attributed to Hippocrates, represented the beginning of the true physician-patient relationship, the natural state of medical practice. In this koinon of two, it was not so much the physician's role that had changed, it was the patient's role, a revolutionary transformation. Engaged in common counsel against illness, the patient and physician could contribute equally to decision making, the physician being the advocate for his patient and for no one else. And it is argued that the honorable physician with such an obligation is far preferable to the legislated physician of an amoral state. Amen. Because of the profound development of medical practice described above, Hippocrates, his proposed dates are 460 to 380 BC, assuming that he actually existed, has become the legendary icon for the modern physician. But the association of Hippocratic medicine with a modest Doric settlement on the eastern Mediterranean island of Kos is unexpected, for neither geography nor demographics support the idea of a medical school on that small island. And it is certain that the broad clinical acuity of Hippocratic medicine did not flow suddenly from a solitary pen. And its origin had to be in the early 5th century or more likely in the 6th century BC. Thus, a more likely source for the origin of medical enlightenment was the ancient city of Miletus, located on the coast of Ionia about 50 miles from Kos, before it was laid waste by the Persians in 496 BC. But whatever its origin, Hippocratic medicine, which many consider the foundation of modern scientific medicine, is shown to be a purely indigenous Hellenic product, owing nothing whatsoever to prior or contemporary civilizations. Now, a lifetime in medicine affords limited opportunity for the tedious acquisition from first-hand clinical experience of new data or observations sufficient for publication. Thus, Hippocrates and Galen, as individuals, have received far too much credit for making medical discoveries. The lionization of these two early physicians is to a great extent attributable to the naivete or clinical incompetence of their medical successors, translators, and biographers. It is obvious that complex clinical analyses from many assembled observations of many Hippocratic physicians were used to transcend the limitations of individual clinical experience. Within the collective experience of the Hippocratic Physicians Association, or koinon, the correctness of so many medical analyses is shown in the 70 Hippocratic treatises that exist to be proof that scientific revision, in other words, confirmation of or improvement on pre-existing knowledge, was made over time. The profession of medicine could now be defined as a science as well as an art. Early Greek clinicians understood that diseases of civilization were not God inflicted, a prerequisite for rational medicine. And with population growth and enlarging cities enabling physicians to cease their itinerant existence, the profession became more responsive to societal pressures, but most importantly, remain uninhibited by official or bureaucratic entanglements. Therapeutic options were limited, and the pharmacopoeia was relatively small compared to the massive lists of supposed medicaments posed in other civilizations. In the Egyptian papyri, there are over 800. In the Indian writings, there are about 2,000. In the mass of the Chinese encyclopedias, also about 2,000. For the Hippocratics, it was 130. And this, of course, reflected the more critical assessments of its components. Medicine was a profession requiring hard work to obtain a livelihood, and the Hippocratic practitioner engaged in both medical and surgical treatments. Now, with regard to social pressures and the Hippocratic Oath, there are profound limits on the assistance that a person can expect from a stranger, unless society establishes by custom or by laws a form of compensation for the stranger. Compassion, as a modern virtue and viewed as commanding some vague form of intrinsic emotional compensation, and one traditionally identified with medicine, holds no special place in that profession, and at times can be counterproductive. A problem identified by the Hippocratics, more important by far, is humaneness, which we can define as a kinship of all sentient life expressed through kindness and mercy. Now, humaneness was a component of many ancient philosophical doctrines, but it expressed the thinking of but a few individual philosophers who, living in authoritarian societies, devised those doctrines and wished to inculcate humaneness into their followers. In contrast, Greek humaneness became a component of daily life, concurrently with individual liberty. Although no discoverer of this virtue, and this is not to say the ancient Greeks were particularly humane, especially to animals and to their enemies, the Greeks in medicine have elevated humaneness from philosophy to action. The reason, of course, as stated by Frederick Douglass, is that virtue, in this case the virtue of humaneness, is impossible in the absence of freedom of choice. It was therefore the Greeks that injected humaneness into medicine. The Hippocratic Oath was not intended to mold a physician into the perfect man. It was a humane working document outlining the physician's obligations, and its enforcement was based on trust. But concurrently with the decline of Greek city-state democracies, a progress that began in the 4th century BC, Greek medicine sadly became less attractive as a profession over the next 2 centuries, and fewer practitioners were identified with Hippocrates. Concurrently, in ascendant Rome, scientific medicine never became an established vocation. As Rome embraced the Mediterranean, its medicine was for the most part provided by alternative practitioners, often Greek, and sometimes Greek slaves, who had acquired a modicum of Hippocratic knowledge. And this process was well advanced as the Common Era opened and virtually complete shortly thereafter. And it was against these incompetents that Galen in the 2nd century AD railed. Possible reasons for the loss of Hippocratic medicine are presented, but only one seems adequate to the task. Early in the 1st century BC, Roman guilds, or collegia, became increasingly regulated by the state that frowned on plebeian organizations in general and Greek organizations in particular. Thus, in addition to a diminishing number of Hippocratic physicians, concurrent with a declining and destabilized Greece, the proximate cause of the loss of scientific medicine was the medical profession's inability to sustain within the Roman world medical koinons, or venues of common council, as a source for medical excellence. The medical koinon would have provided a focus for public esteem and thereby recruitment. In its absence, medical attrition was quantitative rather than qualitative, but it was complete. After the Caesars and their successors were replaced in the 4th century AD by a theocratic bureaucracy, nothing remained to fill the void produced by the disappearance of the Hippocratic clinician as the Dark Ages approached.